Hello and welcome to this podcast from the Private Wealth team at Safri. My name's Leonora Stevens. I'm a partner in the Private Wealth team based in Bristol and delighted to be joined virtually by Mike Hodges, a fellow Private Wealth partner at Safri who's based in our Manchester office. We also have a guest speaker today, Peter Harker, who's a fellow partner based in London, and he has a focus on the land and rural sector and is the head of our Natural Capital Group. Hi Peter and welcome.
Good morning, thank you.
So the topic of our discussion today is succession, but not necessarily covering off the detailed inheritance tax considerations around succession, but we're thinking more on the practical matters to consider with a particular focus on landed estates. In fact, the main reason for doing this podcast is to talk about a really interesting report that we've recently released in conjunction with Historic Houses, looking at the challenges of succession and how to effectively pass wealth and assets to the next generation. Now, succession is a topic I feel I discussed most days with a variety of my clients. Why does it matter? If no planning is carried out, then there's potentially up to 40% inheritance tax to pay, which can be penal, in particular if you have an estate which is asset rich and cash poor. So how do they pay the tax? With the land estates, there are added complexities. It could be made up of farmland that's actively being farmed. There may be residential properties, potentially some land used for natural capital purposes or a solar farm, or potential development land. So thought does need to be given to each of these different elements and whether relief from inheritance taxes are available, or clients can undertake planning to mitigate those taxes, such as Balfour planning. There's also the additional unknown due to potential change in government and the lack of certainty as to what changes may be made to agricultural or business property reliefs, specifically affecting the rural sector. Plus, do your children want to inherit the estate from you? Are they put off from running the estate? And if so, what are landowners going to do about it? So coming back to the report, a key statistic I noted is that around $100 trillion is set to be passed down to millennials and Gen X heirs over the next 20 years. So it would appear that there is a lot of scope for some tax planning to be done. So the aim of the report is to help estate owners and heirs with their succession planning. Peter, as you were instrumental in preparing this report, would you like to give a little background into why the report was initiated and what your top findings from the report were?
Certainly. Well, succession planning is always a key topic for clients and in particular landed estates. It's definitely not getting any simpler. We, as a firm, last did a major succession project back in 2005, not long after I joined the firm, and we thought it'd be interesting to revisit this to see what's changed, if anything. Our survey had 140 respondents reply to it, which was a mix of clients, contacts and Historic Houses members who either own estates or are expecting to inherit. We were really pleased with the engagement with the survey, and we had a good cross-section of estate sizes and geography. One of the most striking facts for me to come out of this was that 42% of survey respondents acknowledged that they don't currently have a plan or process in place to prepare the next generation to run the family estate. This 42% represented a combined estate value of more than £300 million. This presents a significant risk to the ongoing management and long-term viability of some of the UK's most important real estates and natural assets. A real issue and something which we want to help really sort of highlight the opportunities here. We also drilled down to what people considered to be the purpose of succession to actually be. Only 56% of people said the primary purpose was mitigating IHT exposure. But for those for whom IHT wasn't the key factor, the focus is very much on long-term resilience, family cohesion, preservation of both family assets and values, and minimising the risk of disputes.
It's really interesting, isn't it, about the sort of the percentage of those who haven't got a plan. It seems to be whether succession does it go into the it's too difficult to deal with box, or as you said, with that sort of relatively high percentage, 56%, about the IHT mitigation. But it's a really difficult plan to make.
It's vital though, isn't it? Because I'm having this conversation week in, week out with clients just to say you need a plan. And that's where I quite often will say, and I reserve nagging rights, because they will disappear and get swamped by the day job. And then periodically, I think it's our job, and I don't apologize for it, to go in and say, you haven't made any progress with that longer term plan. Let's carve out some time and we can help facilitate that whole thing, because otherwise there's no sense of direction. And I've had something come through just our website. We get regular inquiries, and one from someone who's in their late 80s. You're thinking, well, that's probably a bit late in the day. I'm hoping they live a long and fruitful life. But at that stage, you have left it until a bit too late.
I think we'll probably cover that later on, but people are living longer. The next gen are wanting to get their normal sort of non-estate career underway, and everything just takes place a lot later than before. But coming back to the report, Peter, what would you say surprised you most from the report?
There were a few things. One thing to highlight, we had 53% of respondents told us that their most pressing fear for the estate in the future is that it stays in the family. I would have thought that number would have been a bit higher, and I think would have thought that keeping the wealth in the family would have been a higher sort of one of the key drivers. And what happens if the heirs to the estate don't actually want? Do they sell up the estate? Do they consider putting into a trust structure? And one other finding, which perhaps wasn't a surprise but did amuse me, we asked the current generation and the next generation over what timescale any form of planned lifetime succession should take place. 32% of current estate owners would like the handover with a successor of more than 5 years, whereas 92% of the inheritors would like a handover of less than 5 years. And actually, when we looked at the data, most of it said 1 or 2 years. So that's of impatience from the next generation to get their hands on the tiller, so to speak, and the caution from the older generation is very typical of what we see amongst clients. But it was interesting to see the stats on that.
I love that 1 to 2 years. They're really keen, aren't they?
Yes.
Can I have it now, please? Yeah.
Basically.
If you look back at what historically what the business of an estate was many years ago, it could just have been farming and a bit of residential property, whereas now they're real commercial enterprises. And I suppose that the next gen might be wanting to come in and sort of shape things up with that sort of more commercial hat on, and we'll come on to diversifying later. But I think that's a real change in their makeup, and therefore that succession is a different beast, really, isn't it?
Yeah.
But then sort of this is definitely the talk of the town about Jeremy Clarkson's farming program, which I have to say I really enjoy. It really does emphasize how difficult it is to make a profit from farming alone, or even with the diversification. If you look at longer term planning and a family, and how does a farm sustain a family, to what's the income going to be generated, the profit, they've got school fees to pay for. Peter, what would you say are the different options or areas of development relating to sort of looking at sustainability of the income source?
I mean, I absolutely agree. I think diversification has never been more important for landowners, with reducing basic payment schemes that sort of coming to the end and tailing off very quickly. Some of the new schemes coming in terms of government support are there. Some more announced very recently, but generally there is a drop in income from farming. So landowners are being forced to be even more entrepreneurial than they ever have been, and look at ways for keeping the estates viable and creating value for long term. The phrase the modern estate has been used more and more without necessarily sort of clear definition. But for me, this means to be a nimble business that's able to adapt quickly and grasp the various opportunities that can arise from land ownership. You mentioned Clarkson's farm, and I've been very much binge watching that and enjoying it. And it does give an excellent portrayal of the challenges of farming, but also just how diverse farming businesses can be. But that he doesn't touch on a number of other wider forms of diversification into commercial property and residential property and renewables, etc. There's a vast array of different things that can be done on land. And a big part of my role is helping advise clients on those different options, and something I really find fascinating and really enjoy. Looking at the report, we had over 80% of estate owners see renewables as a key area for diversification in the future. And more than half of them, 53%, state that biodiversity is a key area for development. I personally think there's huge opportunities for landowners to access these sort of new marketplaces that are opening up. And there are funds, more and more funds available to pay landowners to manage their lands in more environmentally friendly ways. I think that regenerative agriculture is a hugely exciting area at the moment. It allows people to access new funding streams while still continuing to farm. And I'm also spending a lot of time speaking to people about biodiversity net gain schemes at the moment, having only come in a few months ago. So lots of exciting opportunities there. And then the sort of final comment I think on this is one very important area where we come into the mix in terms of professional advice is helping ensure whatever landowners do in terms of diversifying, they have a really good understanding of what this will do to their tax, and in particular when it comes to succession, their IHT profile. For instance, a large lease to a solar developer could potentially jeopardise the availability of business property relief over the entire estate. That doesn't mean it's a bad idea and landowners shouldn't do this, but we can come along and help analyse the situation and look at various different options, whether it be restructuring the ownership or speeding up some succession planning as part of those sorts of considerations.
I suppose that, that all comes back to, no one size fits all, that something may work for one landowner that doesn't work for another, but it's looking at it in the round, in the bigger picture, which is where we can sort of add value in that front, is to maximise the benefits and release where we can. If that is an area they want to focus on, we can try and incorporate that into the overall plan.
Mm.
And then as I briefly touched on it before, people are inheriting estates at an older age, and the income is no longer going to support 1, 2, 3 generations of a family, where you then have multiple siblings, school fees. It's an expensive task, really, isn't it? When it looks at succession in this brilliant report, which I'm a big fan of, we are talking about sort of incoming heirs and what the top 10 tips for succession planning would be. Do you want to briefly cover those?
Yes, so certainly. I suppose before we get into top tips, if there's one word summarises, it's communication. That is absolutely key and at the heart of any sort of succession plan. But just sort of cover across the 10 tips that we've got in our report. So tip 1 is to formally review your inheritance and succession plans on a regular basis, as well as following any key life events, either for your family or for your assets. And having a will which is periodically reviewed as part of this is vital. Next tip is stick to your word, or at the very least communicate any changes of intention. We've seen many occasions where there's been things that have been miscommunicated within families, and when it comes on the sad event of death, it can cause real sort of family ruptures and difficulties. In the worst case scenario, these cases end up in court and a huge amount of value is wasted, if you see what I mean, because siblings fall out and it can be a terribly sad situation. I think the next tip is one very much for the current generation looking to pass down. This is to be sensitive to the likelihood that other generations will make different assumptions to that of your own. Just because you think that's the way that something should be done, you've got to be aligned and aware of the fact that the people who are inheriting the land estate, your business, may very well have different thoughts about how they want to run it in the future. And I think you've got to be very realistic and accepting of that. And then tip 4, which is again communication, is manage expectations from both sides to help avoid conflicts. I sort of touched on that already in terms of the making sure there's those open dialogues. Next point is don't overlook the value and experience of existing staff and colleagues as to how they've helped to shape the estate. Many rural land estates, it's a team effort. Maybe Clarkson's farm, going back to that, is a really good scenario. Example is the series paints, there is quite a big team of people there behind the business. And in any rural estate we deal with, there's typically a number of people working in the estate office who all keep the cogs turning and actually really understand how the business works at different levels. So lean into that knowledge and do make the most of it. It's not necessarily just about the immediate family. The next tip is siblings and partners should be included in the process, their views and input being valuable. I think siblings by default probably are part of it, but it's quite an interesting one. I've had a discussion with a few people as to whether or not the husbands or wives who've married into the estate should have a say or not. But fundamentally, they are going to be, hopefully, as long as there's no marital breakdown, be involved in the process of running that estate for many, many years to come. And it's key to have them on board and part of the journey. Our next tip is to have frank, honest and open communications. So again, that comes back to that communication point, and avoid any unpleasant surprises. Tip 8, very much our field, is to ensure you have suitable tax and business structure plans. Ideally, they should have some flexibility to adapt to change. So that's very much where we spend a lot of our time talking to clients, ensuring that the plans that are in place are both suitable for the family and their needs and their wishes, but also stack up when it comes to the financials and the tax analysis of it. Tip 9, again, a bit of a plug for ourselves, but not only ourselves, involve your advisors. We're here to help you. It's a team effort. It's typically ourselves as tax advisors, but also lawyers and land agents can have a really, really key role to play in these conversations. And then finally, keep track of the external environment, political and economic changes, to try and avoid any sort of surprises. It's a topic we're often talking about with potential change of government on the horizon. what might that look like in terms of the IHT release that are currently in place. We've often talked about risk of changes to how BPRs are assessed, and is APR going to stick around for the future. All of these topics are really key for rural estates, and just ensuring that your plans are adaptable, and you don't just sort of do your planning and put it in the top drawer and think that's done. You've got to have an eye to what's changing, and again, that's where we come in to provide that proactive advice to ensure that people are up to speed and kept up to date with all these matters.
I think it's interesting that in the top tips we come in at number 8. It just shows that sort of communication is key, but also Mike and I always talk about this. What are the family's objectives? Yep. And I think that the objectives part, numbers 1 to 7, it's down to them. But equally, we have a lot of experience in seeing these sort of quandaries on a day-to-day basis, so we can help and say, well, various clients have done this and others have done this. So it's sort of, we can aid in those discussions as well. But the hard part is for them to decide what they want, and then how we can help them work out how to achieve that.
Yeah, because so many people, if you ask them that question, well, what do you want? There's a shrug of shoulders, and I do always emphasize, you're not going to decide this in the next hour and a half of an initial meeting. You can have a chat. Everyone goes away, think about it. It's an iterative process, and will take weeks, months, sometimes even years to come to something.
It is definitely a journey, and these conversations are never easy, and it's something which is very easy as a family when families get together only a few times a year perhaps, and so it's not really a conversation you want to have over Christmas dinner. So actually sort of having these structured process to try and encourage healthy conversations about it is key, but equally not deferring it, kick it down the line, as is all too easy to do.
Yeah.
One of in the report, there's an interesting article from the heirs, the current Viscount de Lisle, Honourable Philip Sidney, and it's interesting that he says, recognise that succession is a difficult process. In the corporate world, there are big corporate players who are too scared to walk down the corridor and ask the CEO when they're thinking of leaving. It's even harder when they're your parents. I mean, I think that's brilliant, because it's very true.
Yeah.
If it was a corporate and you had no emotional connection, it's still scary. But when it's your parents, then there's a lot more involved in that.
Absolutely.
So, well, thank you very much, Peter and Mike, for joining me today, which has been what's been a very interesting discussion. If you're interested in reading the report, it is available on our website, and I would recommend taking a read. We work with a wide range of clients. Many are UK based and many live overseas but have interests here, whether that's property, business, interests or investments. We advise individuals and families on how best to safeguard, maintain and enhance their wealth, and on the most appropriate methods of passing on that wealth to the next generation. We also help people comply with the tax laws in the UK, which can be complex. If you'd like to find out more about the services we can offer at Safri, please visit our website at www.safri.com. However, it is important for me to stress that if you're considering any of the topics discussed today, you must always take professional advice based on your individual circumstances. Thank you for listening.